Hello, welcome back to The Wanderlust Reader. My name's V, and today I'm doing a recommendations video, and I'm recommending 5 books by working class writers, and that are about working class people. I think working class fiction is not something that I ever hear really talked about very much at all. It's a topic that I want to talk more about because it's an important one to me, and I think it needs to be talked about more, basically. The 2 older books on the list are American, and the 3 more recent books are British. The first one that I'll talk about is The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. This is set in Chicago around the turn of the 19th, 20th century, and it follows a immigrant family who have come from somewhere, I think, Eastern Europe to America in search of that sort of American dream, a more affluent, a better life. But what they find is a lot of dodginess. It does focus on one guy more than the rest of the family, and he works in one of the factories, one of the meatpacking factories in Chicago. And the point of the story is to expose the brutality of these working environments. They get scammed a lot. They become the victims in some ways of people who are trying to make a profit at the expense of people who perhaps don't know any better. Because obviously they're not they haven't grown up in America, they don't understand how the system works. But the point of the book, it was a expose at the time of the terrible working conditions that people in these sorts of factories went through. I struggled at points through it because it can be quite graphically descriptive. There are descriptions of slaughter and everything that comes after that, and it's quite grim, but it's a good insight, I think, especially as a British person, into the sort of working class of America, the origins of the working class in America, and the sort of immigration aspects of America as well, and the foundation of America. The second one is probably my favourite classic that I have ever read, and that is Martin Eden by Jack London. This follows the titular character called Martin Eden. He is a working class guy in America. Again, similar time period to The Jungle, around the turn of the 20th century. But he meets by chance this upper class family and becomes interested in books and learning. So he teaches himself to read, or rather, he's taught to read, he's taught to write, he becomes literate, and from there he harbours this dream of becoming a writer. And the story sort of follows him as he keeps trying to go up in the world. Thematically, it's kind of a bit depressing. Without giving spoilers, it is kind of a bit depressing, but I love that sense of being a working class person and trying to exist in a world that is dominated by those of the upper classes, the middle class, the upper class. And that sense of disconnect, and that sense of you'll never quite fit in, you'll never quite belong, no matter how educated you become. It is a little bit self-autobiographical, I think, for Jack London, and I know Jack London is a bit potentially controversial, but I really enjoyed this book. As I say, it's one of my favourite classics I've ever read, and I think that is because so many of the classics, like you're talking Jane Eyre and not so much Dickens. I mean, Dickens is a whole other problem. But like Jane Eyre and the sort of other Bronte books, they're all about middle class people, upper class people, in fact, a lot of them. They're about a world that people who come from a sort of normal background you can't relate to them. It's not a world you can understand. But this, I think if you do come from a more working class background, and especially going through university and those sorts of things, I think this gives that real sense of, oh, I'm not the only one, right? This has been going on for like at least 100 years at this point, and probably longer. The next one is from the middle of the 20th century, and that is Saturday Night and Sunday Morning by Alan Sillitoe. This is set in 1950s Nottingham, and that's sort of a similar area in the UK to where I live, and so I recognise so much of the language in this from sort of the different generations of my family going back. It follows a guy called Arthur Seaton, and he works in a factory in the sort of 50s, and he's living for the weekend. He just enjoys going out, drinking, womanising, all the rest of it. And the story sort of follows him as he starts to grow up. It's almost like a coming of age novel before there was such a thing as the coming of age novel, I think. It's not about race, obviously. It's a white working class family in Nottingham in the 1950s, but it does have some racism in it, as you would expect of a novel of that time. I try not to judge it too much on that basis because context, but also it's a bit uncomfortable in places later on when there is a black character does make an appearance. It's only a very minor character, but some of the language and things, it just sort of has that uncomfortable feeling about it. But for a representation of what working class life was like in the immediate years after the war, I think this is a really, really good book for that. And again, you just don't get that many books that cover this sort of topic, that are set in a working class neighbourhood, in a working class community, following working class people. The family dynamics, the attitudes, the generational difference between Arthur and his father, who lived through the Depression before the war and was out of work and unemployed, and the sort of contrast in it between Arthur and this sort of sense of abundance, even though he's only a factory worker, and those middle class aspirations of owning a house and a car and all those sorts of things that we now think of as normal, they're not there for him. His aspiration is a council house and to keep doing his job and to provide for a family. And I think it's such a realistic and, I found, positive portrayal of the working class. The next one is a lot more recent, and that is 7-8 years ago, and that is NW by Zadie Smith. And this is another university read. In fact, all of these, except for the one I'm going to talk about next, were university reads. And this is where I feel like my degree was completely worth it, because I have found so much good fiction through my degree. I've read some pretty not very nice fiction, but I've also read some really interesting fiction. And this is one of them. So this is set in London. It follows 4 Londoners, Leah, Natalie, Felix and Nathan, after they've grown up and left their childhood council estate and they've moved on to the different lives. So some are still living on that council estate, some have family living in the council estate, some are a lot more affluent and a lot more in the middle class world, even though, again, it's that sense of there's a particular character in here who has grown up to be a lawyer. And she, even though she has the house and she has the husband and she has the car, there's still that sense of disconnect between her and the world that she's in and the university she attended and the people she's working with. And this also is about, it's about Black Londoners. It's about the different elements of race in Britain. And that's a really interesting dynamic, because that's that sort of intersectional dynamic of race and class, which I find really interesting. I haven't read any of the Zadie Smith yet. I plan on. I've got swing time on my TBR. But I found this, even though it's literary fiction, but it's not the type of literary fiction you read and you think, I don't get this, or this is just, what's the point in this? It's a story. You can see the story in it, which I really appreciate. And I don't know whether that, again, is a reflection of a class thing, because a lot of working class literature is a lot more direct and to the point and has that clarity to it that a lot of your more mainstream, I suppose, middle class literary fiction can be a bit more abstract and out there. And I don't know whether how much class plays into that, or whether it just is Zadie Smith's writing style, and it would be regardless. So that's an interesting thought. Recommended for a more sort of London-centric look at class and race as well. And then the last one is a book that I have raved about recently, and that is Shuggie Ban by Douglas Stewart. I love this book. This is my favourite book of the year, one of my favourite books of all time. I will leave my full review for it up in the cards from a couple of weeks ago. This is set in Scotland. This is set in Glasgow in the 1980s, and it follows Shuggie Ban as he grows up. And he is a child for most of the book, and he's growing up with an alcoholic mother. He's living in a sort of poor housing estate, council estate in Glasgow, and he's growing up queer and he's growing up different. It's that Thatcherite 80s Britain at the aftermath of the closure of the coal mines and the unemployment and poverty that followed that, and really the lack of responsibility that the government took for doing that. It's sad, it's heartbreaking, it's grim, it's depressing, but it is reality. And it's reality for so many people now, as well as in the 80s. It is apparently quite autobiographical. This is absolutely highly recommended. This won the Booker in 2020, and it is completely and utterly deserved. It's the best Booker Prize winner I've ever read. So that is the 5 books that I recommend by working class writers about working class lives. Hopefully I will find more, and hopefully I will do more videos like this, because this is the type of literature that really gets me like excited about books. If you've read any of these books, let me know below. Any thoughts on any of them? If you've got any working class fiction recommendations, always looking for more, drop them in the comments. Like if you like, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you next time with another video.